Hello again, and welcome to this episode of Israel Now podcast, this time in English. Izabella Tabarovsky is a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism, a writer and a sought-after international speaker and lecturer. Her cancellation by Finnish universities earlier this year, 2025, when she was scheduled to lecture on anti-Semitism here, made some headlines in Finland. Eventually, she did visit Finland last June, being invited by Patmos Foundation, Holocaust Memorial Association, and delivered her remarks in a seminar that was organized by Working Group Against Anti-Semitism by Finnish Parliament. She spoke to a fully packed audience that had arrived to hear her in Pikkuparlamentti, that is Little Parliament auditorium. On October, we met with Izabella online to discuss her visit now that the dust had settled. How did it go? Who got happy? And who was made anxious? Also, her book, Be a Refusenik, a Jewish Student's Survival Guide, has recently been released in November and is available from Amazon, and it is highly recommended as a reading to you. So here again, one more time, happy to have Izabella Tabarovsky with me. Welcome to this episode of Israel Now. First, how are you doing, Izabella? How's the life going?
So first of all, it's really good to be back here on your show and to see you again. Life is, certainly not boring. We just had a ceasefire and a return of hostages. I'm in Jerusalem, and of course, it's not the end of the story. So all of that continues. The anti-Semitism that got stirred up by all of these events is not going to go away. So we deal with that. But of course, the return of the 20 hostages who were alive is just an incredibly happy part of what's been going on.
Yeah, indeed. I was watching live this release of these hostages and just rejoicing and weeping same time for that.
As all of us, and here in Israel, this story just continues to be covered. The recovery of the hostages is of national interest. People follow their stories. People follow their photographs of their, meeting with their family members. And one of the hostages, Ron Breslavsky, who came back in a really difficult state, very fragile state. He just went to the sea for the first time with his brother since he came back, and I think basically just left his hospital room for the first time. And so that's kind of it. All of it is part of national interest here in Israel, and people follow it, and it reminds you of just how close knit the society is in many ways, and that respect for the family, and really a feeling that we are all a family.
Right. Now we're going to talk about your visit here in Finland in June, but still one more thing about the hostage release, because what do you think? I think that the world and Europe and Finland being part of Europe has no idea of how deep a trauma October 7 was for the Israel. What do you think?
I think it's accurate, because I try to imagine, for example, if a corresponding number of Americans were taken hostage, kind of proportionately. I don't know what it would be, but let's say there were 20, a certain number that corresponds to the proportion of 20 Israelis that was taken hostage in America. It certainly would have been a big deal. But I don't know if people would have experienced it as such a big trauma, maybe because the country is bigger, maybe because of the history, because what I was thinking about is that the one thing I'm sure the Europeans and the Americans don't fully grasp is, the fact that Israelis have had to deal with this issue of Jews being kidnapped and taken hostage, and then fighting for their release. It's like it's an ongoing issue, and it's an ongoing trauma, and people are so there's a very strong value around not leaving anyone behind and returning redeeming the captives. It's actually very much a Jewish value, and there's a very high value around burying people according to tradition and in the land of Israel for the Israelis. So even with we still have, I think, 18 hostages who are dead out in Gaza, and that's still, so that trauma, it remains. People are still fighting for it. I think I can imagine that maybe for some people in Europe, it may seem like, well, it just doesn't matter, or it matters less. These people are dead. Perhaps it matters, I don't know. Maybe it matters a little bit less, but not much. I mean, people want them to come back. It's really important.
Right, right. And same time, this explosion of anti-Semitism in the world, which has been just a phenomenon in itself. Right. And of course, as we talked before, I guess when you were here, that it was there underneath the surface. It just found a way out.
Right.
With these events. Okay, Izabella, right. June. Let's go. Let's sit in the time machine and go back to the June for a while. This was your first visit to Finland, right?
Correct.
Yeah. What was your impression about this Moominland next to former Soviet Union?
Well, it's interesting that my very first impression when you picked me up at the airport and we drove to my hotel, we drove through some forests and I thought immediately, gosh, this looks so familiar to me. The nature here is so familiar because it's very much like Northern Russian nature. So in many ways, and also even architecturally, parts of Helsinki and parts of other places that I visited, there were the architecture was such, it made me feel like I was in St. Petersburg.
Did you feel like home or did you feel nervous?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, did I feel like home? I don't really feel like, it felt familiar. I don't know if it felt like home, but it felt safe. I have to say, I did feel a little bit. I understand. But I have to say, I did feel a little bit nervous because of what had happened with those universities, because we know what happens on some campuses, and we know that there's been violence. And I didn't really know what to expect in that sense. But I, of course, never felt threatened in any way during the visit. So it was wonderful. And of course, my hosts were wonderful and accompanied me everywhere. So it was from that, in that sense, it felt very good.
I had the pleasure of showing you a little bit around Helsinki as we went here and there. But at the same time, I learned things that I didn't know about. For example, that KGB's anti-Zionist propaganda office right next to my neighborhood where I grew up. I mean, I must have passed it thousands of times, and I didn't know what was going on behind those walls in Lönnrotinkatu and Albertinkatu corner. Well, what was that?
So that was the former headquarters of the World Peace Council, which was
Peace Council. Right.
It was a very famous Soviet front, which claimed to be for peace, but in reality, it was just a front for KGB operations and for staging all kinds of events and festivals and conferences, again, that claimed to be for peace, but were really a channel for Soviet influence and a way to advance Soviet foreign policy agendas. So yes, it was right there in the heart of Helsinki, and you passed by it so many times.
Right, just where I grew up, and I didn't know anything about that place. Okay, were you surprised by the interest towards your lecture? Let me see. Okay, here's a picture of the full-packed Pikkuparlamentti auditorium that came to hear your lecture. Were you surprised?
Well, I didn't really know what to expect. I was certainly very pleased. It was very heartwarming to see the auditorium so full, because I don't know Finnish, I don't know Swedish, so I didn't quite know what impression in the end was left from that cancellation back in January. But clearly, I think what it generated is very often things like that do. It generated a lot of public interest, and I said before, I think I said it in our first interview, and I've written about it, that, had those two lectures just simply happened, whatever, 100 people maybe would have attended the first conference and 50 people would have come to my public lecture, and that would have been it. But by canceling them, they really generated a lot of public interest. And then ultimately, I ended up having a much bigger and more prominent platform to deliver the same exact lecture that I was going to deliver there. And it was, it was, we see so many people being canceled for their supposedly for some kind of views that the progressive orthodoxy views unacceptable. Very few people get vindicated, and I have to say this was a rare moment of vindication. And I thought I felt very proud for the part of the Finnish society that decided that it wants for it to happen, and ultimately to take control of the idea that actually there's freedom of press and freedom of information and freedom of thought in Finland, and it's okay to listen to a lecture that goes against certain narratives.
What kind of feedback did you receive, maybe right after your lecture there, meeting with people?
Well, I thought people were very interested. I heard a lot of very positive remarks, and people kept writing me afterwards. I made a lot of connections on social media with Finns, and just made a lot of very good friends on that visit. So I thought that it was very well received.
Right. Now, your lecture was titled "From the Cold War to University Campuses Today: the USSR, the Third World, and Contemporary Anti-Zionist Discourse." We don't need to go through all the material, and actually people can find it online on the YouTube, your whole lecture there. But could you summarize what was the main, the core message of your lecture? What about the anti-Zionism and in the former Soviet Union?
Well, one of the points I make when I deliver this lecture or a variation on this lecture is that people sometimes think that the anti-Zionist language that we hear on American European campuses today and in the marches, demonstrations against Israel, that they somehow grew organically out of organic resistance to the evil of imperialism, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. The point I make is that it couldn't be further from the truth. It all was manufactured by an industrial strength propaganda machine tested out on audiences that numbered millions over decades and really finessed to produce the kind of slogans that catch people's imagination, that tap right into the existing prejudices about Jews. I mean, they all ultimately derive from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is how Soviet Zionology worked. The fake science of creating the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist propaganda. And another point that I always make is that we frequently hear that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same, and it's become a real mantra. It's like it's a really dogmatic mantra that you're not supposed to question even. I remember that one of the theses that those who canceled me kind of advanced is that, well, she claims that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and therefore she does not have a right to speak to our public. And what I say is that when you look at the history of Soviet Jewry, and you look at the anti-Zionist propaganda that was directed at them and what happened to them, you really see very, very clearly that anti-Zionism does lead to outcomes that are classically anti-Semitic. Jews begin to be pushed out of universities, out of public places, entire career fields start to get close to them. So looking at this history teaches us that, yes, anti-Zionism in the form in which we see it today is anti-Semitic. And I think it's really important to see it through the historical lens, that it's not abstract thinking, it's not some kind of philosophical conclusions, it's not ideological. It's simply something that we see based on historical evidence.
So, for example, the reactions that we saw right after October 7 was not a kind of a spontaneous reaction to just October 7, but it was something that has been worked out for decades. Actually, all that rhetoric that we saw.
Exactly, Exactly. And it's important to understand it because people, so many people were surprised by the speed with which the anti-Israel left jumped to the ideas. They began to claim immediately that Israel was committing genocide, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't just come up with it spontaneously. And it wasn't even a product, there's sort of this view that a lot of people have coalesced around, that this form of anti-Semitism is a product of the latest academic theories and the product of the DEI ideology, that is in fact the diversity, inclusion, and equity ideology that has it's a very misleading name, but an ideology that has kind of seized the left, certainly in the United States. But even that is only the latest iteration of this kind of abiding hatred of Israel and demonization of Zionism. So we're dealing with something that's decades long, in fact. It's been part of the left for many, many decades. And so the left jumps at it. It's a default, when at the slightest sort of provocation, they have their rhetoric, their slogans, their kind of explanatory logic is all there.
Mm-hmm. You described in your lecture and you showed literature that was published in the former Soviet Union. I mean, it was really an industrial level anti-Zionism. And what I found interesting was MP Ben Zyskovits, in his closing remarks, when he mentioned that he remembers when their youth group of their party came from some kind of a trip, they returned to Finland, and at the border, the Soviet border guards, handed them some kind of anti-Zionist leaflets and booklets. So it was kind of just proof of what you just spoke.
I thought it was really interesting to hear him say it. And I'll just say to non-Finnish listeners that Ben Zyskowicz is a member of Finnish parliament, a Jewish member of Finnish parliament. And so after my talk, he came up and gave a few remarks. And yes, he said that it reminded him of how it was. And it happens a lot of times, actually, when I give this lecture, or even when I write about it online, people will say, oh, yeah, I remember this used to be, even Americans who maybe were part of, who were somehow members of the Soviet Jewry campaign who fought on behalf of the refuseniks. They would say, oh, yeah, we saw these brochures, these pamphlets.
Right. Now, the Finnish mainstream media did not, unfortunately, pay much attention to your second visit, even though your previous cancellation was reported in our daily newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat. But the pro-Palestine activists who machinated your cancellation were concerned and alarmed, so much so that they felt necessary to publish a lengthy article on the University of Helsinki website, criticizing your visit in a way that is interesting to analyze with you a little bit. So let me put something here. Now that is the photo that we just looked. One second. I have it there somewhere. Okay, here we go. Now this is the Finnish article, and saying Suomi Yhdysvaltain imperialismin hännystelijänä, but it's not enough to write it for the Finnish audience, so they just also publish it in Rasterfi, which is the anti-racist research network. So this was Helsinki University, as you see on the upper left corner, University of Helsinki website, and by Maja Sekira, and then the Rasterfi. Finland, an eager servant to U.S. imperialism. And you can quickly see that the word imperialism was so important that it's mentioned 9 times in this article. For example, here it says that in the Finnish parliament, combined with the exceptionally strong support for Christian Zionism in Finland, the recent NATO membership creates a political situation in which voices like Tabarovsky's are welcomed with open arms, and Finland is wholeheartedly embracing its stronger than ever alignments with U.S. imperialism. And later again, they talk about this absorbing and pantomime the ideological infrastructure of U.S.-led imperialism, where the imperialist interests of the U.S. and Finnish media whose only objectives appear to be aligned with U.S. imperial interests, and so on and so on. Now, that is interesting. I mean,
go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, if I
this is just case in point, isn't it? Just
exactly. If I ask them for supporting evidence for what I was presenting, they couldn't have come up with a better article, because one of the examples that I use in my lecture is how the Soviets always associated Zionism with American imperialism. And when I read stuff like this, it really makes me feel like it's a throwback to the 1970s. This is how the Soviet Union used to talk. They tied everything to American imperialism because that was the idiom of the time. And I just find it incredibly surprised that people still speak in this way, because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. I left the USSR. When I left it in 1990, I thought, or 1989, I thought it's over, and then the country disappeared. And so I think a lot of us thought, well, everything that country produced will disappear as well. Everything will just be swept away, into the dustbin of history. And yet here it is. It's like it's like I'm listening to a broadcast on Soviet radio. Back to the future. I don't know. Back to the past, whatever. I don't know. The future is the past. Unfortunately, it seems with this brand of the left. And it just, there's a big part of me that just is surprised that the left hasn't advanced any of its thinking since the USSR fell apart. It still remains in the same idiom, and it's really incredible.
So how concerned ought we to be?
Well, I think we should be concerned. I mean, in a way, I think we should laugh at them. I think we should laugh at them more than we do. I think humor is very important and very powerful. So I think they should be ridiculed because they are ridiculous. But we should be concerned simply because not enough people laugh at them. Not enough people understand how ridiculous they are. And so much of the academy is taken over by this stupidity, just absolute stupidity. And, so it is concerning, and I was just discussing with someone recently how I think part of all of this, and maybe it's just an American problem. I don't know, maybe in Europe it's not like that, but certainly in America, the decline of the humanities, the decline of teaching of humanities, I think is wrapped into all of this, because people no longer know, young people don't know how to read a text. They don't know how to analyze it. They can't understand when a text is real and when it's manipulative. So, I think there's so much that fundamentally needs to be changed about what we teach, what we don't teach, what we should teach. It's not only the factual side of history. I always complain that nobody teaches, people teach and understand the story of Nazi Germany, but the history of communism is not really, and especially the history of communism as it was implemented in the USSR is not taught. So there is that. But I think there is really a broader problem. The broader problem is that people are just not really even taught how to tell genuine thought from ideology.
Right. Have you thought, and what is your opinion on the fact that this anti-Zionist thinking and rhetoric, it always seems to come these days from the left? Has the Soviet campaign worked so well? I mean, you can even here in Finland, when you look at the how it follows the party lines, it seems to come from the Social Democrat, from the leftist, and the Green Party, of course. That's where we can find these rhetorics, and I've sometimes been wondering that why is it like this? There are exceptions, of course.
Well, I mean, the Soviets targeted the left, of course. That was their target for decades. And I think that it does, there are links in all of this with through lines, to Lenin and Marx. So in fact, if I usually look at I traced this genealogy of this specific rhetoric to around 67, the Six-Day War. That's when it was a turning point. And then that's when this rhetoric really exploded. And that's when the Soviets intentionally assigned institutes to work on it, to develop it, to deepen it. But in fact, elements of it go further back. And so in many ways, it's a very natural position for the left to take. Overall, the socialist left had always been against Zionism, and they always said that they were, just like they're against nationalism of any kind, because socialists are internationalists, so therefore they're against Jewish nationalism as well. But of course, Zionism always occupied a special place in that universe. They were especially against Zionism, not just against, because they didn't have anything ultimately against Palestinian nationalism, for example, but Jewish nationalism became a problem. But I do want to say that today we're seeing this on parts of the right as well in the US, and that portion of the right is called the woke right, which kind of as a mirror image of the woke left. And I don't 100% understand why. I understood why we call the woke left the woke. I don't quite understand why we call the woke right the woke right. But I do see, there are prominent people there who are speaking basically in the same language. But the only difference is that they're not embarrassed to also just simply talk about Jews running the universe. On the left, they're embarrassed by that. They don't do it. They avoid it. They understand that it would put them in line with fascists and Nazis. The woke right anti-Zionists are not afraid to also be openly anti-Semitic.
Yeah, this has been very interesting and concerning development, which I have also followed. People who have very strong name recognition among the conservative and liberals and right have turned out to be, as you mentioned, the woke right. But Izabella, coming back to October 7, where we started, and the explosion of anti-Semitism, the war will be over sometime. We don't know, maybe not yet. The ceasefire is very fragile, and all this campaigning against Israel is going to continue. But how should we be prepared for the day when eventually the war will be over, and what will happen to this anti-Zionism after that?
I think that it certainly will not go away. And I think that what we need to do, I actually just wrote an article about it.
Will it go into hiding? You think so?
I think that it will probably go out of headlines. But what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't allow ourselves to be lulled into complacence anymore. Because the truth is, I just did a quick search. And I knew this already from before, but I did some additional digging. And, already in the 70s, there were Jewish groups, prominent groups like the World Jewish Congress, Jewish leaders, Israeli ambassadors who were warning about anti-Zionism as a leading form of anti-Semitic hate. Already in 1970, there was a very prominent Jewish sociologist in the US who wrote a long piece in the New York Times where he said that the label Zionist is now being used kind of like it's the equivalent to Jew, so it's being used in anti-Semitic ways. So here's the truth, is that people have been aware of the growth of anti-Zionism since the 1970s, since it began to gain currency, and they have been warning about it. But every time we have ignored it, and every time it explodes, it's like we look at it, it's like, wow, where did this come from? We haven't seen anything like this before. And we again call it some kind of new anti-Semitism is what we call it. Even for the Westerners, even for Americans, even for Jews in America and even Europe, this is not new. And yet, every time we allow ourselves to forget, I think maybe we think that next time it's not going to happen. I don't know. So I think that what we need to do is to promise ourselves that we won't forget. In fact, we will use this opportunity to study anti-Zionism, to understand its logic better, to understand how it works, to understand the propaganda techniques that have been used over the past 2 years in order to, for academic reasons, but also in order to prepare for next time, because next time it will come and it will use the same techniques and it will use the same slogans. And we shouldn't be surprised then. We should come to that moment because that next moment will come. And when it comes, we should be prepared.
Right. Very, very important thoughts and words. Izabella, it's been fun, if I can use that word.
For me too, as always.
to meet you again online like this, and hopefully one day again face to face somewhere. You are also actively writing. Your articles can be found from the Tablet magazine online. I understand that the book is coming finally.
Yes. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So my book is going to be, it's called Be a Refusenik, a Jewish Student's Survival Guide. I actually think this may be the first time I'm publicly saying the title of the book. In this book, I look at the example of the refuseniks, and I also talk about today's activists, and I see a lot of parallels in the anti-Zionist oppression that they face. And I think that there is a lot to learn from the past in this as well. And today's activists are already doing that without realizing it. They're already doing what the young Soviet refuseniks did in order to not to defeat anti-Zionism. They didn't even do that, but in order to survive and thrive and ultimately win over a culture that wanted to extinguish and to marginalize them. So yes, thank you for asking. And I'm soon going to have my own website where I will have all of my articles listed, because right now they're all over the place, but soon there will be one place where they will all be listed.
Great. I'm looking forward to having a link to that website and sharing that information with our viewers. Izabella, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. It's been very, very educational for all our viewers here in Finland and of course, hopefully for internationally. Thank you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm once again grateful for your support of Israel and the Jewish people, and for all of the Finnish people who support us. I'm very, very grateful for that.
Thank you. It's our pleasure. Thank you, Izabella. Mm-hmm. This was Israel Now this time, and we will meet again after a week or so. So until then, have a good night.